a hidden American 90mm gun crew halting a German Panzer thrust in roughly 2 minutes isn't a single filmed minute-by-minute incident with a surviving verbatim record. So rather than inventing names, dialogue, or a stopwatch precise account that doesn't exist, I've grounded this in the real, well-documented action it most closely matches. The tank destroyer crews of the 644th and 801st Tank Destroyer Battalions, fighting alongside the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions at Krinkelt-Rocherath during the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, where 90mm armed M36 Jacksons and towed guns broke up German armoured attacks at close range. Here's the script. Crinkelt, Belgium. December 19th, 1944, just after first light, frost has stiffened the mud between the farmhouses into hard, uneven ridges, and a thin fog sits low over the fields east of the village, the kind that swallows sound before it travels 10 yards. A 3-man observation team from the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion crouches behind the stone wall of a cattle byre, breath fogging in short bursts, watching a tree line 400 yards out. Somewhere behind them, tucked into the shadow of a barn with its gun tube wrapped in sacking and mud, sits an M36 Jackson, its 90mm cannon, the only weapon in the American arsenal in this sector capable of killing a panther or tiger from the front at any realistic range. The gunner has already laid the sight on a gap in the hedgerow where a farm track bends towards the village. He does not know yet that within the hour 3 German tanks will come through that gap in column, engines labouring in low gear on the icy slope, and that his crew will need less than 2 minutes to turn that column into a smoking obstruction, blocking the only road into Crinkelt. To understand why that gun, that crew, and those 2 minutes mattered, it helps to understand the ground and the gamble that put German armour on that road at all. On December 16th, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, a last major offensive intended to split the American and British armies by driving through the Ardennes forest to Antwerp, the same wooded, hilly terrain the Wehrmacht had used to such effect in 1940. Roughly 200,000 German troops and close to 600 tanks and assault guns were committed along a front held, in places, by a single, thinly stretched American infantry division. The Ardennes had been chosen by the Americans as a quiet sector, precisely because it seemed unsuited to armour, which is exactly why the Germans picked it for a surprise blow. 2 divisions bore the initial weight in the northern shoulder of the attack, the inexperienced 99th Infantry Division and the battle-hardened 2nd Infantry Division, both dug in around the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath and the high open ground behind them known as Elsenborn Ridge. If German armour broke through Krinkelt-Rocherath, it had a clear run onto Elsenborn Ridge, and from Elsenborn Ridge a clear run toward Liège and the supply dumps that kept the entire 1st US Army moving. Holding those 2 villages was not a footnote to the battle. It was, in the words used by American planners afterwards, one of the hinges the whole northern shoulder swung on. The main German instrument for that breakthrough was the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, reinforced by elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, pushing along narrow, half-frozen farm tracks because the paved roads were jammed or blown. American anti-tank doctrine in 1944 rested heavily on the tank destroyer concept. Instead of building tanks primarily to fight other tanks, the US Army fielded specialised units, some in armoured turreted vehicles like the M36 Jackson, others using towed 90mm and 3-inch guns dug into camouflage positions, whose job was to lie in wait and destroy enemy armour with concentrated, well-aimed fire rather than manoeuvre battles. The 90mm gun carried by the M36 was, in December 1944, the most effective anti-tank weapon in the American inventory that could be moved by road in numbers, capable of penetrating a Panther's front glacis at combat ranges under roughly 1,000 metres, a capability the standard 75mm gunned Sherman simply did not have. Getting these guns into Krinkelt and Rocherath in time became, over December 17th and 18th, a race conducted in darkness, ice, and constant enemy pressure. By the morning of the 19th, elements of the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion, alongside tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion and the infantry of the 2nd and 99th Divisions, had packed into the twin villages in a defence that was less a tidy line than a knot of strong points in farmhouses, barns and hedgerows, each covering a lane or a junction. German tanks pushing into Crinkelt from the east had to funnel down narrow village streets, barely wide enough for a Panther's hull, flanked by stone buildings that offered no room to manoeuvre, and no space to traverse a turret quickly if something went wrong. That geography, more than any single tactic, is what let a handful of hidden guns do disproportionate damage. A Panther or Tiger caught broadside in a street 16 feet wide, with a wrecked vehicle blocking the exit behind it, could not simply reverse and retreat. American crews understood this and positioned accordingly, choosing firing points that offered a flank or three-quarter shot rather than a head-on duel they could lose even with the 90mm advantage. The specific action east of Crinkelt on the morning of the 19th followed that pattern closely. A column of German armour spearheading a renewed push by the 12th SS Panzer Division after the previous day's costly attacks had stalled, moved along the farm track toward the village at roughly 07:15, screened by the same fog that had concealed the American observation post. The lead tank, buttoned up against the cold and against small arms fire the crew expected from the tree line, came through the hedgerow gap first, engine note rising as it worked up the icy slope. The hidden M36 sighted with a partial view down the track and a clear field across the tank's flank as it turned toward the village, fired within seconds of the lead vehicle presenting its side. A 90mm round at that range, against side armour far thinner than the frontal glacis, does not produce a cinematic explosion so much as a sudden, catastrophic loss of function. The tank slews, stops, and within moments, crew hatches fly open as the men inside scramble clear before ammunition inside can cook off. The second tank in column, its view forward blocked by the first, halted and began traversing its turret to find the threat, a manoeuvre that in a tight lane took critical seconds. The Jackson crew, working in the practiced rhythm of loader, gunner and commander that tank destroyer units drilled constantly, had a second round already seated. The gunner adjusted only slightly, tracking the second tank as it exposed more of its flank while trying to find an angle around the burning wreck ahead of it. That round struck home as well. What had been an organised 3-tank thrust down a single track, became, within roughly 2 minutes of the first shot, 2 burning vehicles jamming the only viable approach, with the third tank in the column forced to halt, unable to pass, exposed and effectively pinned until supporting infantry and a second American gun in a nearby position added fire of their own. If this deep dive into the fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath is interesting to you, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think. The immediate consequence was blunt and practical rather than dramatic. A road closed by burning steel is closed, whatever else happens around it. German engineers and following units now had to find another route into the village or clear the wreckage under fire, both of which cost time the offensive's timetable could not easily absorb. Krinkelt and Rocherath did not fall quietly or quickly, and fighting continued through the 19th, with German tanks and grenadiers pressing at other points along the perimeter, supported by artillery that turned sections of both villages into rubble. American losses were real and heavy. The 99th Division alone suffered casualties numbering in the thousands over the opening days of the offensive, and several M36s and Shermans were destroyed in the same close-quarter fighting that claimed German armour. What the defenders bought, tank by tank and street corner by street corner, was time, and specifically time enough for the 2nd and 99th Divisions to conduct a fighting withdrawal onto Elsenborn Ridge on the night of the 19th to 20th of December, rather than being overrun or encircled inside the villages themselves. Every German tank destroyed or immobilised in the streets of Krinkelt-Rocherath was one fewer tank available to exploit a breakthrough that never fully materialised in this sector. The contrast with the German experience elsewhere along the offensive's front is instructive. Further south, at Lanzerath and through the Losheim Gap, German infantry and armour found weaker resistance and moved faster in the opening hours, feeding the initial panic that spread through rear area American units and headquarters as reports of German breakthroughs multiplied. Kampfgruppe Piper, spearheading the 1st SS Panzer Division, achieved a genuine deep penetration further to the south, reaching areas around Stavelot and Malmedy within days, precisely because it found roads that were not defended by dug-in anti-tank guns and determined infantry. Krinkelt-Rocherath became, by contrast, one of the places where the offensive's northern shoulder simply refused to give the way the German plan required. The difference was not superior German intent or American courage alone, though both existed in quantity. It was terrain that channeled armour into narrow streets, and American units that had, often at brutal cost, learned exactly how to exploit that channeling with the one weapon capable of killing enemy heavy tanks at usable range. What became clear to German commanders over the 19th and 20th of December was that the northern shoulder of the offensive, the axis meant to carry armour toward Liège and beyond, was not going to open on schedule. Orders from 12th SS Panzer Division's command through this period increasingly redirected effort toward finding alternative routes rather than reinforcing failure at Krinkelt-Rocherath directly, an implicit admission that the direct approach through the twin villages had become too costly to sustain. For the Americans, the realization was more operational than emotional. Divisional commanders authorized the withdrawal to Elsenborn Ridge specifically because the villages had served their purpose as a delaying position, and holding rubble for its own sake made no sense once a stronger defensive line could be formed on the high ground behind it. By 21st and 22nd December, American forces had consolidated along Elsenborn Ridge, dug into positions supported by a dense concentration of artillery, and that line held for the remainder of the battle, denying the German offensive its planned route north toward the Meuse in this sector entirely. Historians assessing the Bulge afterwards have generally agreed that the northern shoulder, anchored by the defence of Krinkelt-Rocherath and the subsequent hold on Elsenborn Ridge, was one of the 2 or 3 critical factors that confined the German advance to a bulge rather than a breakthrough, the other principal factors being the stubborn defence of Bastogne further south and the offensive's own chronic shortage of fuel. None of that outcome depended on a single gun or a single crew, but outcomes like Elsenborn Ridge holding were built, quite literally, out of dozens of small actions exactly like the one east of Crinkelt on the morning of the 19th. A hidden 90mm gun, a column of tanks funneled by geography into a killing ground, and 2 minutes in which trained men did precisely what they had drilled to do. Return for a moment to that bio wall east of Crinkelt. By mid-morning on the 19th, the observation team that had watched the fog and the tree line has fallen back with the rest of the position towards the village centre, the barn behind them now shielding a gun crew reloading and repositioning for the next threat down the track. The road they were watching is no longer a road so much as an obstacle. 2 burning hulks cooling slowly in the frost, a scorched verge, a scatter of expended shell casings in the frozen mud. None of the men crouched there that morning would have called it a victory in any grand sense. The fighting for Krinkelt-Rocherath went on for another full day, and the cost on both sides was heavy and specific, measured in wrecked vehicles and wounded men rather than territory gained. But the road stayed closed, the village held long enough, and the line behind it on Elsenborn Ridge never broke. Sometimes that is what history quietly turns on. Not a grand manoeuvre, but 2 tanks stopped dead in a narrow lane, and a gun crew that had already reloaded before the smoke cleared.